Today, the American public gave a direct answer to a direct question. Yes, they believe Republicans are sabotaging the economy in order to defeat President Obama. In a new poll, 49% say Republicans are intentionally stalling efforts to jumpstart the economy to ensure Obama is not reelected. 50% of independents believe the same, that Republicans have sabotaged the economy for political gain. This is not a new idea, but it has not yet gotten the attention it deserves. Not too long ago, it was the ideal that dare not speak its name. You could accuse Republicans of a lot of things, the thinking went, but surely they would not intentionally sabotage the economy to keep President Obama from winning election, would they? Then came the infamous quote from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said this just before the midterm elections 2 years ago. The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. Senator McConnell caught so much flack for that, he tried to backpedal and said it was simply his chief political goal.
Our top political priority over the next 2 years should be to deny President Obama a second term. Well, that is true. That's my single most important political goal, along with every active Republican in the country, but that's in 2012.
They say Democrats want to create a villain, that it's not true that Republicans sabotaged the president. But then came the book from Robert Draper, detailing how the effort to block Obama began on the very night of his inauguration, with a bevy of Republican lawmakers like Congressman Eric Cantor and Congressman Paul Ryan, as well as the likes of former House Speaker Newt Gingrich and pollster Frank Luntz. They say it's only their principal differences that led them to vote against the president again and again. But here's the catch. When Republicans vote against their own ideas, you know something stinks. When they were for it before they were against it. The Republican Party used to support infrastructure spending, but not when President Obama asks for it. Republicans used to allow deficit spending to get us out of recessions. They did it under their hero, Ronald Reagan. Under President George W. Bush alone, they allowed massive tax cuts, 2 wars, and Medicare Part D, all unpaid for, all of those items ballooning the deficit. Before President Obama, Republicans rarely voiced opposition to the Federal Reserve using monetary policy to help the economy. Under President Obama, the Federal Reserve Chief, Ben Bernanke, is called every name in the book. But you know Republicans are trying to sabotage the economy when they vote against tax cuts, as when they opposed extending the payroll tax cut benefiting middle-class Americans. Let's not forget that Republicans voted against the stimulus bill that was 40% tax cuts. Let's not forget that Republicans brought the country to the precipice of default for the first time in the history of our country over their refusal to extend the debt limit. The intentional stalling continues to this day. The latest specific example is the transportation bill. This bill includes vital infrastructure spending and in years past would garner bipartisan support. These transportation bills are often passed in 5 or 6 increments, but a 2-year extension of the transportation bill is now dwindling to a possible 6-month extension. Republicans like to complain about uncertainty. This creates uncertainty and could cost tens of thousands of jobs. Senator Harry Reid accused Congressman Eric Cantor of trying to sabotage the economy by blocking an agreement on the transportation bill. I'm joined by Norm Ornstein, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and Thomas Mann, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. They are co-authors of the remarkable new book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be with you.
Happy to be with you, Michael.
Thank you, sirs. Republicans intentionally stalling efforts to jumpstart the economy. Give us your view on this. We get a sense of what your book has been about, but give us a deeper insight into this conundrum.
Well, I would say, you're certainly right. If you look at the history of things that have been supported by Republicans in the past and the urgency of action now, and transportation, of course, it's the summer construction jobs in particular, a market that's really hurting badly.
Yeah. Well, here's Bill Maher, a guest, talking about it recently.
Let's be honest. The Republicans are stalling every effort that he has tried to make to create jobs and help the economy.
I spoke to a senator earlier this week, and he told me that a Republican senator told me that Mitch McConnell has told his conference that we're not doing anything. We won't make a single move between now and the election because any move could be risky, and all of the sliding down on President Obama.
Is this idea gaining traction, and does the poll reflect that, you think?
It's been perfectly clear since the beginning of the Obama administration that the minority Republicans saw their way back to power through the failure of President Obama, and that meant the failure of the economy. But as your lead-in suggested so many times, they have moved away from positions that they have long supported once President Obama embraced it.
Right.
We have such powerful incentives for the minority party to take down the majority, whatever the consequences for the economy. And right now, Republicans are so persuaded by the righteousness and wisdom of their way and their leadership that they're prepared to do that.
Yeah, it's certainly to the detriment of the country. Here's the president talking about the Republican hypocrisy on the deficit. Let's take a listen.
It's like somebody goes to a restaurant, orders a big steak dinner, martini, all that stuff, and then, just as you're sitting down, they leave. And accuse you of running up the tab.
Even at Ruth's Chris. That's a good line, but the president really will have to press this case, won't he? He's not yet willing to accuse Republicans of deliberate sabotage. However, should he?
Well, you know, one of the things that did work for him, you mentioned earlier the payroll tax cut. And you had, for a long time, Republicans in Congress resisting the idea of a tax cut for average Americans, even though they've all signed the Norquist Pledge, and that would in effect amount to a tax increase because it had been implemented before. Only when President Obama turned up the heat on this issue and it began to gain political traction did you see some change back. And the fact is, in so many of these areas where Republicans tried to block action or make it seem much, much worse by making it more acrimonious, as long as they could get away with it politically and not suffer, they could go ahead and do it blithely. You got to make it a little harder to make that work and put them more on the defensive, and I think that's what his rhetoric now and the use of the bully pulpit is aimed at doing, which he didn't do for much of the first 2 years.
Roland, I was going to ask you quickly before we leave. You jump in, but I want to ask you, too, what's the fallout from your book? I mean, here you are, a noted conservative, a thinker who's been self-critical in terms of what the Republicans, or especially the conservatives, have done. What's the fallout from all of that?
Well, keep in mind, I'm much more a raging moderate than a conservative. But,
right.
You know, we spent 40 years building reputations of being straightforward, calling it as we see it,
right.
You know, not taking a partisan stance. We're still calling it as we see it, but we're using the political capital we built up because it's necessary and important right now. The country's facing big, big problems. And if you don't lay out where the blame is, then voters aren't going to know who to hold accountable and aren't going to do much about it.
Good enough. Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann, thank you so much for your time tonight. You're watching The Ed Show on MSNBC.com. Stay tuned.